My students hear stories about Guam regularly because I interweave these as I teach. My mother got a contract through government of Guam back in the 60s to be a teacher on Guam. And so she packed up with 2 kids all by herself, and we went to Guam. So I lived on Guam through elementary school, and I'm going to share some geography, of course, about the island of Guam. But I really want to tell you some of the stories about what it was like for me as a kid, because, you know, I'll tell you, what I did in 5th grade, but I'll bet you most of you never did those things in 5th grade. And it just shows a lot about, I grew up rather differently than people, okay? So here, this is the island seal of Guam. The very first week of school, they would drag all the little kids into the school cafeteria, and we all sat with our legs all folded up, and we would learn about the birth of an island. And we had to, the first week of school every year, draw the seal. And it wasn't too bad, for an elementary student to make that picture. And I remember my skills getting better every year. It was a good thing. Guam has this slogan, and it's at the top of our newspaper. It's on all the tourism literature, that Guam is where America's day begins. And this is because Guam is on the other side of the international date line. So the beginning of every day, Guam as a territory of the United States sees the light of the new day before any other territories belonging to the United States. And so it kind of makes us famous. You'll see I've shared a little geography here. This is the location of Guam, part of the Mariana Islands. And when I was a kid, we always would tell people we live halfway between Japan and Australia and on the other side of the Philippines. Because people that had a very difficult idea visualizing where Guam is. When I first went to Guam when we were kids, airplanes couldn't hold enough fuel to fly across the Pacific. So it was basically island hopping, LA, Hawaii, Wake, and then finally we would go to Guam. So here's a nice satellite image of the island. It's about 30 miles long from tip to tip. This is the northern end. It's about 9 miles wide here in this little narrow part, and there's a legend that there's a mermaid that lives under Guam, that she and the starfish eat the coral and eat the island, and so eventually it'll get skinnier and skinnier. I primarily lived in the northern area of Guam. We first lived in condemned Air Force housing. Well, that was a treat. There were only 5 houses left on our whole block, and it's because Typhoon Karen had blown away all the rest of the houses. The first year we were there was a little girl in my mother's classroom, and her father was in charge of Guam housing. And so he told my mother, if you teach my little girl to read, I'll get you a new house. And because our house, it was awful. One day we came home, and he actually painted our house, and we left, it was brown. We came home, it was turquoise. Another day we came home, and he had taken the front porch off, put it on the back, and built us a new front porch. Another day we came home, he took all the kitchen apart, and it was, the cabinets were all in the front yard, and he put in new cabinets. But we didn't have a floor in the shower, we just had lattice work. So when you took a shower, the water just ran out under the house, wherever. My brother and I were afraid of it for a long time. We bathed in the kitchen sink because it was too scary. In fact, my mother slept in the same bedroom with us. And when typhoons would come, I remember one was so scary. We were on the bed with Mother, and the walls would suck in and blow out. And you could see when the corners would come apart, the rain coming down. And it was just pretty scary living in this house. But at the end of the year, that little girl could read, and we got a cement house. And so we moved up here to the northern end of the island, and we lived by Anderson Air Force Base, and then my mother got to teach at that other school. But it was very scary. Oops. Now, I had to teach a little more geology. In physical geography and geology, we talk about lithospheric plates. And these are chunks of the lithosphere that either pull apart or slide past one another or push together. And it happens that the Philippine plate, which is here to the left, is pushing together or subducting with the Pacific plate. And that friction between these pushing together generated lots of molten material. And so part of Guam is actually volcanic, and the other part of it is primarily a limestone that you could think of like with coral. To the east here then, we have the deepest place on the planet Earth, and it's approximately 7 miles deep. And I remember as a little kid, well, nothing ever went down there because it was so far. But with the advent of technology and submersibles, there have been watercraft down there with their lights seeing what's at the very deepest part of the Earth. And that's called the Marianas Trench. But it's a nice thing for me to share with my students this change in technology that's allowed us to explore more, because when I was little, we had no clue. So here's another map of Guam. This is where the international airport is in the center, and you might want to remember that for later. And then here's Anderson Air Force Base where we lived. So when I was in 5th grade, like I don't know what you guys did in 5th grade, but my teacher, Mr. Sneller, took us on a bus, and we had our little lunch bags, and we went to the southern end of the island down here, and we climbed up the volcano, and we ate our little lunches on top of the volcano that made Guam. Yes. And on the way home on the bus, we learned how to sing Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog. So, yeah, I can still sing that song. And, you know, I know it's really fun in 5th grade. You get to have field trips or whatever, but, you know, I got to climb a volcano and eat my lunch on the top of the volcano. Something just a little different than what folks experience around here. Okay? And here's another little story. Down here at Cocos Island, we used to go down to the beaches here because they were very different than in the north. And I got sunburned really, really bad. And we had a boy, I'll tell you more about him later, that lived with us from one of the other islands. And he broke open a coconut and took that meat out of the coconut and rubbed it all over me, which, what did it do? Made me burn more, but it felt good. It felt good. Today, there's a lot of little tourist things that go down there. So, Amber, I know you know all this geology. That's okay. We're glad you're here. So, did I get just one? No, there, I keep hitting it twice. In physical geography, I do an introduction to climatology. Guam is in the tropics. It's just about 12 degrees north of the equator, and we live in what is called a tropical rainforest. Rain. We always tell people we have seasons on Guam like other folks. They are rain, rainy, rainier, and rainiest. And I remember there were times when I was in 4th and 5th grade when I had to catch the bus because it was so wet in the morning. There were snails, big snails that just covered the yard. And my mother would give us the salt shaker, and we would go like this, and the snails would, ooh, and it would clear a path so I could walk out to the road to get the bus. But it was just always wet. You know, we didn't leave things in the hamper because they mildewed and they were ruined. And we just, you know, we just couldn't keep things. Gov Guam gave every teacher a full freezer. We kept all our cereal in the freezer because everything would go bad. It would get all soggy and it tasted horrible. But it was always, always very wet. It like rained every single morning. Amber?
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
That's fine.
So do you have any like habits of that? Do you keep your cereal in the freezer?
I keep all my chili in the freezer. You know, that's a good question. There are things that I do that are still a little different than people. I can't think of I keep a lot of stuff in the freezer. I have a large upright freezer in my basement. Then maybe, Yeah, maybe it just felt comfortable for me to have that versus, you know, an upright one. You reminded me of another thing. You know, I told you that we were so afraid to take showers. When we moved in the cement house, we had a bathtub, and my mother bought us some Mr. Bubble. And my brother and I took bubble baths and bubble baths and bubble baths because it was so much fun to be able to take a bath. But when we had typhoons, I have a note up here. You know, we live in the northern extent of what's Tornado Alley. So on Guam, we lived in Typhoon Alley. And we were always told, you know, you were in some condition, some level of a tropical storm coming. And when a typhoon was approaching, we had forced regulations of things that we had to do. And one of them, you knew, we were going to lose power, we were going to lose water, and we always filled our bathtub with water because we wouldn't have water for lots and lots of days. When we lived in that house up off the ground, you know, on stilts that come down to Air Force housing, that was our first year on Guam. When we had a typhoon, teachers were required to stay in their classrooms. And those were the safe places because they were, you know, made out of cinder block. And the reason my mother had to go stay at the school was so all the local people in your classroom didn't steal your classroom supplies. Yes. And then if the typhoon was bad enough, the government, you know how we get these warnings like with Hurricane Harvey and all these things that happen, please evacuate. Well, we didn't have a choice. The government would come by with 2 pickup trucks, and one of them had big sheets of plywood, and they would just nail them to your house where the windows or whatever were. And the second truck, they made you climb in the back of the truck and would drive you to the schools. You didn't stay in your house. We didn't have choices. It was just mandatory. And I remember my mother had a car, so they let us drive to the school, and we didn't have to ride in the truck. But they did nail up our house. And in that particular typhoon, the roof was taken off of one of the schools. So can you imagine the teacher in there watching everybody, don't steal my stuff, and there goes the roof. It was, you know, different. And because we're on the edge of this, you know, Philippine plate where the Pacific plate is. Another thing that we did in school that I know you folks don't do, because you have tornado drills and fire drills, well, we had earthquake drills. And every teacher had an assigned place out on the playground. And when we had earthquakes or earthquake drills, we had to go lay in our assigned place on the playground. So we were out of the buildings and away from anything that it would fall on us. So, lay on the ground? Yeah. We did. We all laid on the ground. That's just, that's, yeah, that's what they had us do. So, you know, when I came back to the States, and because I came to Michigan when I was in junior high, I'm like, what's the deal with this tornado thing and make us go in the bathroom? I'm used to going out on the playground and laying, you know, on the dirt. So these are some pictures of what the lush vegetation looks like. We had coconut trees that were like this short looking so that we could just get coconuts. We had banana trees, very short stubby bananas that are not those nice eating bananas. One of the pastimes that people do or did when I was there, and it seems to be a big tourism market because I looked it up online now, is we go boonie stomping. We don't call the jungle, it's the boonies. And this, you can see it's really, really dense. This is what it looked at the edge of our backyard. And so as kids, we would be allowed to play in there. It was a mile from our backyard to the edge of the island, the big cliff, and down to the ocean. And where we had a house, when we had our cement house, there were 5 houses. The rule was the oldest kid got to carry the machete. And so we would, you know, a parade of kids. And my first year in the cement house, it was this guy, this kid we called Big John, and he got to carry the machete. And we would go off and play in the jungle. And I remember when he hit a bee's nest and we all got stung, we all go running back to the house. But I mean, we would poke and taunt big coconut crabs, and we just cut stuff down. And by the time I got in 5th grade, I was the oldest kid, so I got to carry the machete, you know, and lead all the other kids into the boonies. The southern end of the island, there are lots and lots of these hikes with the volcanic rock that's in the southern end of the island. There's a lot of black sand beaches. This is at Telefofo Falls, and we would just go through the jungle. There were never signs when I was there. You just kind of went on these paths, and you could get into these areas where there was this really tall grass. It was called sword grass, and it would slice you like paper cuts. So we always had to be really careful of that, because whenever you got a cut, it would immediately inflame. You got a scratch from your cat, and it's because of the humidity. Our first year on Guam, my brother was in kindergarten, but it wasn't part of school, you know, public school. So my mother had to pay for my brother to go to kindergarten. And he showed up to school with a cut on his arm, and we hadn't been to the doctor, and so they wouldn't allow him in the school. So they made him sit on the curb of the highway. There was only one highway that went around the island. We didn't have phones, so my brother was 5 and sat there on the curb all day long, waiting till my mother got out of school. It was just a rule. We weren't allowed to be in contact, because we would pass, you know, impetigo and this fungus and this whatever, and we constantly had penicillin shots. And we're all 3, my brother, mother, and I, we are all allergic to penicillin now, because we probably, you know, were overdosed as kids. And another thing, because of that climate, we had, you know, really bad mosquitoes and bugs all the time. So this is what my mother did every week. Take off the linens and wash the bed. And my mother sprayed our beds with black flag. Yeah, with DDT. So I slept in DDT, a fresh dose, every week through elementary school. You wouldn't do that today, but that's how we lived. And we didn't, that's all we had. And that's how my mother kept the bugs and stuff off of us at nighttime. So,
can we go back to the boonies for a minute?
Yeah.
What kind of wildlife was there? Were you the tigers and bears and lions?
no,
killed
no.
too?
There's not a lot of natural things. When I lived on Guam, there were no snakes, so we never had to worry about it. Snakes were brought over later, and I remember when a snake was discovered, and it went on an electric pole that crossed the main highway, and it fried to death, and it was the front page of the newspaper. Most things were brought over on ships from explorers and so forth. My neighbor that lived in house number 2, Mr. Kilpatrick, would hunt, and we would just sit at the edge of the boonies in lawn chairs. The oldest kid got to sit up all night with Mr. Kilpatrick for the hunting. And when I got to be the oldest kid, you know, it was like he'd shoot the deer, and we'd string it on the clothesline thing, and I learned to gut animals and all kinds of things. There were wild boar. And the problem, we had chickens too. The problem with these things is that whenever we had a typhoon, everything's all over the place. So, you know, if you had a boar, it's not yours anymore. Or, you know, chickens or whatever. And this stuff was all loose in the boonies. We would find chickens all the time. And the boy that lived with us, because he was going to school, he and my mother took turns. Like my mother would go to graduate school Monday and Wednesday, and Balance would go Tuesday and Thursday. And when Balance took care of us in the evening, he would take us to the boonies, and we learned to catch chickens and whatever for dinner with a string. And we'd tie them to the clothesline pole, you know, wait till they died, and you know, take it inside and cook it and eat it.
You didn't chop their heads off?
No, we just hung them upside down. We did it with conch too. You tie it on the foot and hang it from the clothesline pole, and gravity would just kill everything. And so, you know, I learned to make dinner: lemon trees, peppers, coconut, all out of the boonies, and that's what we did on Tuesday and Thursday. So there are animals and stuff, but most of it was brought in and came in on ships. And the snakes have become a problem. This is a plumeria. This is what they make the lays out of. If you've ever been to Hawaii and you got a pretty lay, okay? These are poisonous. Hibiscus were not. And as a kid, we used to eat the flowers, hibiscus, the red petals and stuff, but we always learned not to eat those. I remember when my brother learned to ride a bicycle and went head first into the plumeria tree. It was like, ha, ha, ha. Served him right. So, whoops. We spent every weekend at the beach. I mean, that's just what you did. You piled in cars, and everybody was always at the beach. Balance. This is the boy that came to live with us. He was actually from Magellan, which is an atoll. And if you could get a family to sponsor you on the island of Guam, then you could go to high school. And Balance lived with us for 2 years through his high school, and then he went to the University of Guam. He's a banker in California. So he took us to the beach. He went with us. We learned to poke sea cucumbers, and they spit their guts out, their organs, and we would put them on our feet like shoes so we could walk on the coral. And then he would take us, you know, with a spear, and we'd learn to get fish and, you know, dinner. Balance taught us a lot of cool stuff. In fact, you can look at these things later. This is a purse made out of coconut fiber that his mother made for me. So this is my purse as a little girl. This is what it looks like at the north end of the island. So during the Vietnam War, because we lived next to the base, and I'll talk about the military some more, but just before I want you to think about this. The planes going to Vietnam and coming back could not carry enough fuel. So all the B-52 bombers went in and out of Andersen Air Force Base on Guam. We lived, like, the gate was from me to Taylor. So we heard bombers like a grandfather clock. And so we were just numb to it. But every morning in school in 5th grade, we learned about war, and we would hear things like another bomber didn't get a takeoff, and they just literally crashed into the ocean. And so, I mean, that was just part of life for us in learning about war every day. You do have to be careful of the coral. They taught us that a lot, because if you get pushed into it by wave action, it shreds your skin. Now you're all infected, more penicillin shots. And I learned to swim with jellyfish. We went to USO day camp every summer, and we swam with sharks, and, you know, I am not afraid of the ocean. I don't like to swim in the lakes here. I think it's weird, you people with that muck. That's like, ooh, but I'm not, no problem. Seaweed or seagrass or anything doesn't bother me at all. So every weekend we were really at the beach, but we always swam in shoes. So one year for Easter, my mother took us to a cave on the beach with this other family, and we got a Paz Easter egg coloring kit. Every 6 months the Navy ship would come. So my mother would have to buy supplies 6 months in advance. And so she must have planned with this family that we were going to have Easter. So she got some eggs, and they were hard-boiled. And we camped in this cave on the sand, and the lady and my mother, you know, hid the eggs in the morning in the cave. And we crawled around on the coral, you know, and stuff looking for the Easter eggs. And during the day, we made a giant Easter bunny on the sand. You know, my mother was a teacher, so we did all these creative things. And then our Easter bunny was naked, so we had to go swimming and go get seaweed and stuff to make him some shorts. And coloring Easter eggs in salt water does not work very well. We did not have brilliant colors, but it was a lot of fun, and it's one of the things I remember is Easter in a cave. So historically, Magellan was on Guam. Okay, he was not a nice person. One time he sailed back into Umatic Bay at the southern end of the island. The islanders were pissed at him and literally burned his huts and burned him out of the island. And that's how he got to the Philippines. He was not nice to the Filipinos either. And so that's where he got killed. And it was a big deal when Magellan gets back to the Iberian Peninsula and they go through the ship's log to find out if there was like a mutiny or anything. And that's actually when it was figured out that there's something going on about the Earth rotating and either going ahead a day if you go one direction or going back a day, because there was a day missing out of the log from Magellan's crew. But the Spanish colonized Guam, and there's a lot of flavor of Spanish and Mexican culture. So because I'm from New Mexico, any of that Spanish-Mexican culture was a very easy thing for us to adapt to. The language, the Guamanian people speak a language called Chamorro, which is related to Austronesian languages out of Australia, but it is very flavored with Spanish. So people that understand Spanish usually start to pick up things. The Catholic Church is the dominant church on the island of Guam. When I lived there, Mass was in Latin, so we didn't go. We went at Christmas, but it was all in Latin, so I have no clue what they talked about. Guam was captured by the Japanese during World War II. And as we would explore various beaches and go from place to place, there was always some gun thing left from the war. And there are, names Gun Beach and stuff, and it all relates to the war. So in 1944, Guam is then liberated and it goes back to the Americans. But a problem with this is during war, you drop all these bombs. So here's a picture of this bomb. There's a kid. This is one of the parks. Well, yeah. Now you have to remember I lived in condemned Air Force housing, and we only had a few houses on each block. About 3 blocks over, 2 little boys that were my age had been collecting pieces of grenades because the stuff was just all over. You talk about, remember Princess Diana went into Yugoslavia to help deal with the landmines and so forth. Well, we just had bomb and stuff all over. These little boys were playing with their grenade collection under their house and pulled the pin in a grenade, and they were under the kitchen where their mother was making dinner, and it blew up the house and killed the kids and the mom. So it was a very real thing. The school that I went to, the entryway, one day they found a bomb like this. I remember how big it was, this shape, right on our schoolyard. It was a common thing that they would find more bombs, and you have to go to your safe places, or sometimes they would send us home, and they would just send you home knowing no parents were there, and we were just running all around the neighborhood or whatever. But there's still a lot of this around. When I was in 5th grade, they found a Japanese soldier. He was a war hero in Japan. This is where he had lived. He made this structure under the roots of a banyan tree. This is the tourism thing that exists now. I remember 5th grade math lesson. We had to take the amount of money in Japanese yen that the Japanese government gave this soldier in back pay for 28 years, and we had to figure out the conversion rate and figure out how much money he actually got. It was like $1,000, for 28 years. He thought the war was still going on. But I mean, that was one of our 5th grade math lessons, was calculate what?
They didn't find him until 1972.
Yeah. He was living, because the boonies are so dense, he thought the war was still going on. And yeah. But it was amazing. But that was 5th grade math, was to figure out, his back pay, which was like nothing. So another thing that happened in 5th grade because of the Vietnam War was, I don't know, are you familiar with the POW MIA bracelets? Well, this is my bracelet that I got in 5th grade, and I don't mind passing it around. We talked about the Vietnam War every day because it was so much a part of our lives. in the summers of 1971 and 1972, because my mother was a teacher, my brother and I were always in the school. And my brother and I helped dismantle our school. All the tables, the chairs, everything off the walls, and it was stored away, because this is when we were bringing our troops back from Vietnam and we were leaving. And the troops were, many of them, some went to Okinawa, but many went to Guam. And we put up cots and tents, and they lived in our school. There was a fence, but it had an opening that if you were 10 or less, you could just go back and forth. There was no control like there is today. So my brother and I were always on the base. The theater, the movie theater, was outdoors with these benches, and we helped on the base put up cots and tents for all these soldiers coming back from Vietnam. And I was 10 years old, and I sat with those soldiers, excuse me, and I watched the original MASH with those guys right out of the jungle. It was, I don't remember any of them. I just remember this like aura of war, and these people, these soldiers that they were broken. And you know, as they came back to the States, they were spit on. They were not treated with any reverence or respect. And right now, I live by 3 Vietnam vets. One of them, my neighbor Scott, was there just before I went to Guam, and they sent him to Okinawa. He went with a Marine unit of over 300 people, and they came back with less than 80, and he tells me stories. He watched people just get blown up. So those people I was sitting with as a little girl were them. Another Vietnam vet that lives by me, he was there in Vietnam when I was on Guam, and he got blown up a lot. And he was put on a Navy ship, and they took him to Nimitz, the naval medical base on Guam. And so he was in the hospital on Guam when I was a little girl there. So the Vietnam War is really kind of difficult for me. But it was what we lived every day. And we did. We were the stopping point for the soldiers to come back to the States. So today, and Kendall hears this, Taylor's heard this in my class, you know, I really like to make sure that people know where Guam is, because as we deal with issues with North Korea and China, are Taiwan and China going to get along? You know, Guam is the staging place. I have some students right now that are in the Marines that I've asked them, are you going to be sent back to the Pacific this year for the summer when the semester's over? And they are going. They have orders to go already. Because of Mount Pinatubo erupting and destroying Clark Air Force Base, it was in such a mess that the American government did not want to repair Clark Air Force Base. And there are a lot of issues with Okinawa and the soldiers getting into local issues with local people. And so there's a pull out of Okinawa. So the only place that we have American territory to stage our military power in dealing with Asia is in Guam. And I just pulled this up. Look at this. This was in a news article. You know, there's 7,000 military personnel right there right now. And it's something to watch for, because it's going to be part of our lives. And it's just been a long history of war on Guam. So anyway, I bet you didn't eat this stuff in 5th grade either. Have you seen papaya? Okay. When I was in 4th and 5th grade, first of all, I wasn't allowed to ride the bus to school with the kids from the base. I had to ride with the local kids. So I was the only white person on my bus. And the kids were like, you know, what's the deal with all this blonde hair? So they would touch me all the time, and it got really, really icky. So the bus driver got a chair from a Child's Play set and tied it to that post in the front of the bus, and that's where I had to ride to school. But at school, because there were other white kids, we kind of like blended in better. But the Guamanian children used to bring in little bags, you know, snacks. You know how you bring snacks to school and you pass them around under the desk? Well, we ate pickled papaya. And we didn't have candy because we didn't have military privileges. We just didn't get stuff. We got candy from Japan, but it was awful. So we used to throw it away and eat the wrappers because the wrappers were made out of rice. But other than that, yeah, we ate pickled papaya. Spam, what would the world do without Spam? We didn't get fresh meat. And so we ate a lot of Spam. My mother's a terrible, terrible cook. So, you know, she abused Spam in every way you can ever imagine. And we ate it. This is what school lunch was. It was a scoop of rice with whatever in it. Sometimes it was bits of fish, sometimes, lots of times it was Spam, but we did have chickens. And so it was this on your tray with, oh, come on in. It was this on the tray with some saucy stuff over it. And we didn't have fresh milk, so all the milk was brought in powdered, and they would add water to it and put it in cartons and sell it. My brother and I thought you people in the States were so weird. When we came back to the States was when Pringles were invented. Potato chips in a can. We had only ever seen potato chips in a can. So, you know, it was kind of you were weird. These are two Guamanian dishes, chicken kelaguen. It's kind of a version of a stir fry. And of course, it always has rice. And then we ate lumpia. Lumpia really comes from the Philippines and is kind of like eating an egg roll. And so, you know, that's just some of the examples of stuff we would eat. And Paula, you know, if we didn't get out of the boonies. Because, you know, when we got a boar, then there was a contest between the little boys and the little girls, and we each got a wagon and a machete, and we had to go into the boonies and get coconuts and lemons and peppers and tangatang wood, whatever the contest was. And Mr. Kilpatrick always had a prize for us. And we would cut the meat in strips and smoke it over tangatang wood and dip it in a sauce that was soy sauce and chili and lemon. But you know, we ate out of the boonies, so that's kind of what it was. And so this is my last slide. This is my brother and I. Santa Claus didn't come, you know, in a sleigh. He arrived in a helicopter. We had one store, and the helicopter would land on top of the one store. It was 18 miles to go to town, you know, so, you know, you planned. And he didn't peek through the windows. He peeked through the louvers. He rode around in a caribou cart. And my mother had to order our presents, you know, 6 months in advance because that's when the Navy ship came. And who knew what size you were, you know, in 6 months or whatever. But yeah, that's our Christmas picture from when we first went to Guam. And in Chamorro, when we say hello or goodbye, we say hafa ade. And I thank you.